Good morning, everyone. I'll be taking you through my research, which is the linguistic conceptualization of menstruation through the eyes of the Sri Lankan woman. Menstruation is a normal occurrence among women worldwide and takes up a significant portion of their lives. But despite this occurrence being very normal, it's also one that is strongly stigmatized, leading to quite a distinct experience. Religions, culture, and society all influence different people's varied conceptions of menstruation. Many cultures have a distaste for the subject, which derives from the dislike of bodily fluids. As a result, it's considered a taboo phrase and merits a certain amount of censorship similar to those pertaining urine and even sexual acts. Several studies have validated the negative sentiment in the places where they have decided to investigate, leading to findings where the experience is viewed as a disease or even a curse. On the other hand, research has also demonstrated that menstruation may be seen differently by using studies that examine it from a creative perspective or through the use of humor. In Sri Lanka, the traditional academic discourse of menstruation often focuses on medical issues and financial challenges such as period poverty. And although it has been superficially admitted that such a notion is taboo in Sri Lankan culture, there hasn't been much committed research that has taken the time to look at the continuation of its taboo status in language and the cognitive and societal ramifications of the linguistic choice. Which brings us to our research questions. Number one, what are the linguistic conceptualizations used by Sri Lankan women to pertain to the notion of menstruation? 2. How does the social, cultural, ethnic, and religious environments in Sri Lanka influence how menstruation is linguistically conceptualized? And 3. What does the extremistic nature of these linguistic conceptualizations say about the different mitigation levels employed? And these questions are consequently the premise of my research objectives, which are as follows. And the theoretical framework with which my research is premised is on Larkoff and Johnson's 1980s conceptual metaphor theory, a theory in cognitive linguistics which will serve as the foundation of my study. It describes how a metaphor functions not just as a poetic novelty, but also is often believed, rather as a result of a mental manifestation of one domain of experience being mapped onto another. A metaphor is not only limited to just its properties within language, rather it's also fueled by people's actions, thoughts, forming and restructuring, and even creating reality. A few of the different principles within the CMT theory which will be explored are as follows. A conceptual metaphor is a systematic set of correspondence between two domains of experience. Metaphors occur not only in language but also in thought, and metaphors are grounded in the bodily experience. Metaphors should not be seen as arbitrary linguistic expressions but also as reflections of experiences, values, and cultural and context-induced factors. One example I could use for this theory is the concept of argument as war. If one took the time to study how people discuss arguments, the terms winning or losing, taking a stance, gaining or losing ground, attacking or finding a position indefensible, counteracting an opponent, or abandoning a line, these are all common phrases which are used in the concept of arguments. And the metaphorical aspect here is not a conscious decision to sound poetic, but rather is spoken about in a literal sense, because these concepts are not mutually exclusive to a select few, but rather a fairly common means of discussing arguments. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that the usage of these specific terms are not meaningless, but rather an expression of how individuals unconsciously interpret arguments. Another theory that is highlighted within my research is the exfemism theory, which is suggested by Allen and Burridge. They originally coined this term to recognize the distinctions of the various types of euphemisms. There are euphemisms which they call sweet talk, dysphemisms which are offensive talk, and autophemisms which is termed as a speech that is neutral or straightforward. And this theory is very relevant to my research because it heavily focuses on taboos and the concept of politeness and impoliteness, and which is why it's highly pertinent to my research. To highlight a few notable trends within the existing research, I'd first talk about the parallelisms within the studies, where similar conceptualizations were discovered in studies that examined the subject. Another factor that I noticed were the cultural influences that were observed in societies, both Western and non-Western, where some were unreserved in their conceptualizations of menstruation, while the others were rather discreet about it. Another important factor that shouldn't be forgotten in the discourse of menstruation is gender, where observations and contrasts were made between men and women. And with regard to my sample, I subjected the study on those who identify as Sri Lankan women, age of 18 and above, which is the legal age of majority in Sri Lanka. Besides this factor, there were no restrictions imposed on those who were eligible to be respondents to ensure as much diversity in my sample as possible. The research participants were administered a questionnaire consisting of both closed-ended and open-ended questions. The research method that I had employed was the systematic metaphor analysis, which allows for a systematic reflection of the metaphor by which the metaphors can be narrowed down to clear structure of patterns. I had extracted 303 expressions from the data, some which were recurrent, which were then grouped into thematic categories on the basis of their shared semantic meanings, for the convenience of further analysis and interpretations. The proposed classifications are as follows. And through my research, these were the conceptual metaphors that I had identified. Which brings us to the discussion. As you can see, although the terminology used to describe the conceptual metaphors had minor differences, this study found several conceptualizations that were comparable to some of the other studies. In Sri Lanka, the stigma associated with menstruation has not completely eased, in spite of the progress made throughout the years, which was something that I realized while I was doing my research. Women are still hesitant to participate in open discussion about it, particularly with those who do not share the same experience. Likewise, in addition to these commonalities with other cultures, it is also clear that Sri Lanka has a distinct position to add to this particular conversation. And despite the importance of this research, it is also not without its limitations, which are as follows. And this brings us to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your time.